Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 148 of Brew Talk with Mr. Beer. My name is Robert Lewis. I will once again be your host for today's show. As always, we appreciate you guys taking the time to tune in, watch your videos. Hopefully you're enjoying them and learning a little bit of something along the way. If you ever want to read our videos or go back and see what our notes are, you can just find those on our website, mrbeer.com/blog. Just go to mrbeer.com, click on the blog button. So if you guys have a specific question or you're like, oh, I remember that in a certain video, but I don't remember where, and you want to go read about it, there you can go read about it instead of trying to find it in the video audio. So today's topic is how to ferment your homebrew in 7 days. I think this would be an interesting one. And if you're like me, I think one of the hardest parts about home brewing is just waiting for the beer to ferment. I have very little patience when it comes to, well, really much of anything, but waiting for beer to ferment and then to bottle it, condition it, can just seem like it's taking forever to get your beer done. So I thought it'd be a little good idea to break down how you can ferment your beer in 7 days. If you know anything about brewing in general, or like craft beer, brewing on a big scale, they ferment in several days and it's done. The longest fermentation at most breweries is going to be 7 days, unless they're doing something extravagant and crazy like some giant stout or something like that. But it's all so dialed in and controlled that they can do that and know exactly when the beer is done fermenting. But you can also do that and replicate that in your home brew to kind of brew your batches a little quicker. So before we dive into exactly what to do, just the stages of fermentation to kind of give you an overview of how that goes. The first 72 hours is going to be most active. That's when the yeast is going to ferment down all those simple sugars and just go to town. That's where you're going to see the most activity in your fermenter and all that stuff. And after that, it's going to seem like it's not doing its thing, but it's still kind of fermenting along some of those, or fermenting out those complex sugars that are in there. So it goes simple sugars first, then more complex sugars to break them down throughout that process. So that's kind of the basic stages of fermentation. It's basically 2 stages. You have the first 72 hours, and then after that, I think it's called high krausen, which is when it rises really high, all the activity gets going in there. And then after that is when you just get to kind of the later stages of fermentation, where it doesn't seem as active, but it's still kind of doing its thing. So the key to fermenting a beer in 7 days is to having your home brewing process dialed in to be like exact. You need to make sure that everything is set, stone, there's no variables, nothing's fluctuating, you're good to go. And that will help. So first, you need to make sure, obviously, that you're using clean and appropriate water for home brewing. We've done a video about what types of water to use for your home brew. If you want to learn about that, I recommend watching that video on YouTube or on our website. But basically, you want to make sure you're using the right water. If you're using like tap water, for example, you can use that. It's perfectly fine to brew. It doesn't really affect your beer, but there are additive chemicals in there that can kind of linger in your beer, potentially leave some off flavors that may need a little longer to ferment to kind of just clean all that stuff up a little bit. So the cleaner water you're using, the cleaner beer you're going to have, the quicker you're going to get through that process. Next, you want to make sure that your temperature is spot on, specifically 2 types of temperature, your brewing temperature and when you're pitching your yeast. So now the brewing temperature is going to range on what type of yeast you're using, depending on if you're brewing a recipe, one of our standard refills, or just any other different type of home brew you happen to be brewing. You want to read your instructions and find the proper range for the yeast that you are using. For example, with our standard Mr.Beer yeast that comes in all of our cans, it's used in some recipes and not other recipes. We found that the ideal range is 70 to 72 degrees. That 72 degree mark is really spot on. That's where we set our brew room to. It does better a little warm, and it ferments a little faster. So we ferment all of our ale yeast that we brew with. So our Mr.Beer yeast, S33, that's a lager yeast. No, it's not. S33, USO5, SO4, Nottingham, the Saison yeast, any of those, we just fermented that same range of 70 to 72. That's what works best, in our location, in our brew room. That's where we're seeing that beers will ferment the fastest and the cleanest. So make sure you check what recipe you're using, what yeast you're using, and make sure you can hold that temperature consistently during the brewing process. If you have fluctuations in there, that can cause some issues. I know in the first 72 hours, there's most activity, so it is going to get a little warm in there, but then it should cool off. But you want to be able to hold a constant temp the best you can. If you got fluctuations of 5 to 6 degrees, going on all the time, it's going to cause some issues, and your beer won't ferment as quick as it normally could if you can hold a temp with a degree or two of range in there. And like I said, you also need to make sure that your wort is the proper temperature as well before you pitch your yeast. This is all based on your brewing instructions. They usually tell you what temp it needs to be at. Usually it's at the fermenting temperature for the most part, maybe slightly warmer. But what this does is help propagate your yeast, help it grow really fast, and help it just get really active straight from the get-go. If you pitch it too cold, it could take a while for it to kind of warm up and get cruising. If you pitch it too hot, you could kill some of the yeast and not have enough viable yeast cells to ferment your beer quickly in 7 days. Yeah, so temperature is key with that one. I think that's the most important spot, is temperature. If you want to ferment your beer in 7 days, know your temps and be able to hold them consistently throughout the entire process. Another factor is you need to make sure that all your brewing equipment is thoroughly clean and sanitized. We kind of went over this in our last video about header retention in beer. But again, this is very important just for overall fermentation processes, just general good brewing practices. Make sure all your equipment is clean. If you got dust floating in there, different particles, different stuff, those can lead to slightly off flavors that when you go to taste test your beer, you're like, it tastes funky. You gotta let it ferment for a few days to clean out those off flavors. Yeah, so if you have all those steps dialed in, basically it's mostly your temperature, clean water, make sure everything else is clean. That's all dialed in. It should help you ferment your beer quicker. There are probably the best tool you need. You do need a tool though to tell you obviously when your beer is done. We've seen some people use like the tilt, which is basically you put in your beer, connects an app on your smartphone. It'll tell you when your beer is done. But if you want to kick it old school, you can use a hydrometer. That's what we sell on the website. That's what we use. But basically, we've done a video on how to use hydrometer. But to use your hydrometer, what you'll do is after you create your wort, before you pitch your yeast, you're going to take a reading with your hydrometer. That's going to give you a number. It's basically the density of the liquid. So some will start at 1.050, for example. And as the beer ferments, it's gonna the density is gonna drop because it's eating up all those sugars and it's getting all that kind of thicker stuff out of there. And your gravity will decrease. So you start at 1.050 and it'll drop to 1.009 or something like that. The best way to know that your beer is done fermenting is that your gravity will not change within a 24-hour period. So if you want to ferment your beer in 7 days, you'll take before you pitch your yeast, take your initial gravity reading, drop that down just so you have it for safekeeping. On day 6, take a gravity reading. Then on day 7, take another gravity reading. If those gravity readings are the exact same from day 6 to day 7, then your beer is done. Or you can take one on day 7 and one on day 8, and your beer is done. You're bottling on day 8. So if the gravity does not change within 24 hours, that means your beer is done fermenting and you're good to go. You've reached what is your final gravity. So the proper equipment, proper temperatures, great water, you can brew a beer in 7 days and cruise along there. Little side tip for you. If you brew your beer in 7 days and you try one after it's carbonating and conditioning and you feel like, man, this has a slight off flavor in it, there's just something that's not right in here, then it probably just needs to condition a little longer. I mean, that's where a lot of changes in flavor will happen during conditioning. Yeah, fermentation is great, gets those sugars out, gets the alcohol, but when you get to those later stages of fermentation, it's not going to make a huge difference. You really want to get that beer off that yeast rub and get into some bottles. So that's why bottle conditioning is key to help improving flavor in your beer. So if you try one, you ferment for 7 days, carbonate condition, you try one, like it's off, let your beer sit, at room temp for another 7 days and put one in the fridge and try it and see if that improves. And we recommend doing this process until you hit a stage where, it's a weird accent there, until you hit a stage where your beer tastes good. So that's probably the most important part, is the conditioning part over everything else. But yeah, so to wrap it up, to ferment your homebrew in 7 days, great water, temperature control is key, consistent temperature control is key, and make sure everything is clean and use a hydrometer or a tilt or something like that. So that's going to wrap it up for this week's video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Make sure to check us out on social media. We're at Mr.Beer on Facebook, Instagram, and the YouTube. If you want to hang out with fellow Mr.Beer brewers, join our Facebook group, Mr.Beer's Brewing Society. You can find that just by searching that on Facebook. And that will wrap it up for this week's video. Now I'll talk to you guys next time. Cheers. Cheers.